There's a peculiar moment in American business history when a single concession item, a paper tub of buttered corn, became more valuable to the survival of a theater than the movies themselves. Not because popcorn was a luxury, but because the mathematics of admission prices made it nearly impossible to keep the lights on any other way. Most people believe movie theaters made their money from ticket sales. This belief feels instinctive. You pay to get in. The theater gets paid. Economics solved. But the reality, the actual financial structure of running a mid-sized theater through the 1960s and 1970s, tells an almost opposite story. And understanding why explains something much deeper about why thousands of independent theaters have vanished from American towns and why the surviving chains are locked in an endless squeeze. Let's walk through the actual numbers, not estimates or generalizations. The real cost structure of operating a neighborhood movie theater in 1975, the kind of place that sat maybe 600 to 800 people and ran films 6 or 7 days a week. A theater owner in that era had to cover several fixed costs before a single ticket was sold. These costs didn't fluctuate with attendance. They happened every single day whether 300 people came through the doors or 30. The building itself, whether owned or leased, represented the largest of these obligations. A modestly sized theater might pay between $2 and $4 per month in rent or mortgage. In 1975 dollars, that's roughly $1 1.00 to $2 2.00 to $1 2.00 to $1 2.000 in a good week. That's an enormous anchor. Then came staffing. During the 1970s, a theater required a manager, typically the owner or a hired professional. That was $4.000, $6.000 per month in wages. You needed projectionists. Often there were two, one for the day shift and one for the evening. These were skilled tradespeople who understood the mechanical precision required to thread film, adjust focus, maintain the film gates, and handle the enormous reels of 35mm film. Each projectionist earned around $2.50 to $4.000 per month. Then came the concession staff, the ushers, the box office attendant. A theater needed at least 3 to 4 people working on any given day, and more during weekends. That payroll alone could reach $1.500 to $2.500 per month. Utilities were another perpetual drain. A theater building, especially the larger ones, had to maintain climate control year-round. Heating in winter, cooling in summer. The projection equipment generated significant heat and required constant air circulation. The lights in the auditorium, even when dimmed, stayed on during showtimes. Emergency lighting, hallway lighting, bathroom lighting, electricity consumption for a theater could run $4 to $7.00 per month. Add gas heating in winter months and water for the bathrooms, and utilities alone sometimes approached $1,000 monthly. Maintenance was relentless and often unexpected. The projection equipment required constant care, cleaning film gates, adjusting sprockets, replacing belts, fixing sound systems. The seats needed repair. The carpets needed cleaning. The plumbing failed. The roof leaked. In a well-run theater, owners budgeted 5 to 10% of gross revenue just for maintenance surprises. That's another $4.00 to $1.200 per month, depending on the theater's size and condition. Insurance, liability, property, workers' compensation could easily run $3 to $5 monthly. Advertising to draw people in, whether through newspaper ads, radio spots, or billboard rentals, often consumed another $4.00 to $6.00 per month. Add this all together, just the basic, non-negotiable operational costs of a mid-sized theater in 1975. Rent or mortgage, $3 per month. Staffing, $2.000 per month. Utilities, $8.00 per month. Maintenance and repairs, $8.00 per month. Insurance, $4.00 per month. Advertising, $5.00 per month. That's $7.00500 per month in pure fixed operational costs before the theater earned a single dollar from any source. In 1975 currency, that's roughly $4.100 in today's money. The theater needed to hit that number just to break even, just to have a reason to open the doors. Now, how much revenue came from ticket sales? That's where the story becomes genuinely counterintuitive. In the 1970s, the average ticket price at a neighborhood theater was between $3 and $4. Some theaters charged $1 or $2 less to stay competitive. Let's call it $3.50 average. A theater that filled 40% of its seats at each showing, which was actually considered respectable for a suburban theater, would gross about $1, $400 per showing if it had 800 seats. Most theaters ran 2 or 3 showings per evening during the week, sometimes up to 4 on weekends. Let's say an average evening brought in about $3 for $500 in ticket revenue. Multiply that by 7 days a week, and you're looking at roughly $2 for $54. That looks like it covers the $7 in fixed costs with room to spare, right? Not quite, because ticket revenue was never entirely the theater's to keep. This is the moment when the AMC situation becomes important to understand, but not in the way most people think about it. The film distributors, the studios themselves, didn't simply sell movies to theaters. They didn't say, here's the movie, charge whatever you want and keep whatever you make. The relationship was far more extractive. Distributors took a cut of every ticket sold. This was called the split, and it was brutal. In the early days of a film's theatrical run, the first or second week when demand was highest and audiences were most eager, the distributor might take 50, 60, or even 70% of ticket revenue. In later weeks when the film was older and fewer people wanted to see it, the theater might get a slightly better deal, perhaps keeping 50 to 60% of the revenue. But averaged across the entire month, most theaters were giving away half or more of their ticket revenue to the studios. This meant that $2 4,500 monthly ticket revenue actually netted the theater only $1 2.00 to $1 3.00 in actual proceeds. The theater kept maybe $1 2.00, the distributors took around $1 2.00, so now the theater's true position becomes visible. The theater was collecting about $1 2.000 to $1 3 to 1 to $1 3 to 1 per month from ticket sales after the studio took its cut. The theater's fixed operating costs were $7.500 per month. That left a thin margin of only $4 2.500 to $5. $500 per month to cover any unexpected expenses, provide profit to the owner, or save for future equipment replacement. But here's the critical insight. That margin was utterly unreliable. A week of bad weather could slash attendance by 20 or 30%. A popular new release elsewhere could cannibalize the audience. A competing theater opening nearby could be catastrophic. The theater had no control over what films it received. Distributors essentially assigned movies to theaters, and therefore no control over whether those films would draw crowds. An owner could be locked into showing a film that bombed at the box office while still paying all those fixed costs and still handing over half of whatever money did come in. This was the trap. Ticket sales alone couldn't reliably support the business. The margin was too thin, the variables too many, the distributors cut too steep. Theater owners needed another revenue stream, one they controlled entirely, one that didn't require sharing with Hollywood, and one that could be produced at a much higher profit margin than films. That stream was concessions. And this is where the economics flip into something unexpected. Because while a theater owner had virtually no control over ticket pricing, the distributors influenced that heavily, and they were all locked into similar pricing anyway, the owner had complete control over concession pricing. And the profit margin on concessions was staggering compared to any other aspect of the business. The actual cost of popcorn to the theater was minimal. A large bag of popcorn kernels that cost maybe $0 to $30 to $0.50 in wholesale bulk could fill dozens of servings. The butter topping, artificial and cheap, cost fractions of a cent per serving. The salt was pennies. The container, wax-lined paper bucket, maybe $0.05 to $0.115 each. A large popcorn that sold for $1.50 or $2.00 in the 1970s cost the theater perhaps $0. 20 to $0.30 in actual goods to produce? That's a profit margin of 85 to 90%. Nothing else in a theater, certainly not tickets, came close to that margin. Soft drinks were equally profitable. A fountain drink that cost $0.75 or $1. $0 to buy from the concession counter had cost the theater maybe $0.08 to $0.12 in syrup, water, cup, and lid. That's 85 to 90% profit as well. Candy had similar economics. Boxes of candy bought by the theater at wholesale for $0.115 to $0.20 per piece could be sold for $0. 50 to $0.75. The markup was relentless. If a theater could move just $2 to $3.000 in concessions per week, that translated to $1.600 to $2.400 per week in pure profit after subtracting the cost of goods. Multiply that by 4 weeks and you're looking at $6. $400 to $9.600 per month in profit from concessions alone. That's not revenue, that's actual profit. That margin doesn't exist in almost any other retail business. It's a financial unicorn. Suddenly, the entire financial structure of the theater becomes clear. The ticket sales kept the lights on and paid the fixed costs. The concessions, the popcorn, the candy, the drinks, were where the actual profit lived. The theater owner's true business wasn't showing films, it was selling snacks at astronomical markups to a captive audience in a dark room. This inversion of purpose explains 1,000 decisions that seemed irrational from a customer experience perspective but made perfect financial sense from an operator's view. It explains why concession prices were so astronomically high relative to what you could buy those same items for at a grocery store. It wasn't price gouging in the sense of greed, it was simple mathematics. The theater needed those margins to stay alive. If popcorn were priced at cost plus 10%, like a grocery store operation, the theater would collapse. The owner would have had no profit cushion, no way to cover equipment failure, no ability to survive a slow month. It explains why theaters began aggressive upselling and bundling. Combo deals, popcorn plus drink plus candy at a slightly reduced total price but still overwhelming profit, became the default. Because theater owners understood the mathematics of survival better than anyone, snack sales were the margin of life. It explains why theaters became so protective of outside snacks. A customer bringing in food from outside wasn't just lost revenue in an abstract sense. It was the difference between a theater surviving the month or closing. That rule wasn't arbitrary, it was existential. If customers brought outside snacks to 20% of showings, that could mean the loss of $1 to $1 to $1 $800 in monthly profit. For a theater with a $4 $500 to $5 $500 margin from all sources, that's the difference between viability and bankruptcy. And it explains the strange persistence of the movie theater business through decades of technological change and declining attendance. In the 1980s and 1990s, as VCRs arrived and television became more sophisticated, ticket attendance should have killed the theater business entirely. And it nearly did. But the theaters that survived, especially the chains that evolved into what we know today, understood that they weren't in the movie business. They were in the concession business. The movie was simply the excuse that got people to sit in a dark room for 2 hours without leaving. This is why the reference to AMC matters, but again, not in the way conventional analysis suggests. AMC and the other surviving chains didn't simply raise popcorn prices because they could. They raised them because they had to. Because the underlying math of theater ownership hadn't changed in 50 years. Tickets alone couldn't support the operation, concessions had to carry the burden, and as margins compressed everywhere else, as studios demanded higher cuts, as attendance declined, as labor costs rose, concession pricing had to rise proportionally, or the business model would break. What most people didn't understand, and what the conventional narrative about greedy theaters misses entirely, is that theaters weren't choosing to be expensive because of corporate greed. They were being forced to be expensive because the entire ecosystem of film distribution was structured to extract value from every possible point except the theater itself. The studio got its cut, the landlord got rent, the equipment manufacturers charged premium prices. The only lever a theater owner had left was concession pricing. It was the only place where a theater could actually capture margin, and margin was survival. Understanding this changes how we think about the entire chain collapse of the 1980s and 1990s, and why the surviving theaters operate the way they do today. It wasn't about charging customers more for greed. It was about an entire economic structure that had become structurally dependent on concessions for survival. The theater owner was trapped in a vice between the distributors squeezing ticket revenue and customers resisting higher snack prices. That vice only tightened as decades went on. And if you want to understand the complete financial picture of how theater chains actually made or failed to make money through every era of American business, from the grand palaces of the 1920s through the mall multiplexes of the 1980s and into the AMC situation today, our complete guide breaks down the full cost structure, the distributor relationships, and how the profit math actually worked in each era. You'll find it linked in the description and pinned in the comments, and it goes much deeper than what we can cover in a single video. But for now, the core insight remains. When you paid that shocking price for popcorn, you weren't overpaying for a snack. You were paying for the entire building to stay open. The problem, though, wasn't just the squeeze on individual theater owners. It was systemic. By the 1960s and 1970s, the entire American movie theater business had evolved into something almost unrecognizable from what it had been 30 years earlier. The Grand Palace theaters, Those ornate, irreplaceable monuments that had defined moviegoing in the 1920s and 1930s were already dying or converting into multiplex shells. But the new wave of smaller multiplex theaters that replaced them operated under entirely different economics. A multiplex theater in 1975 might have 6 screens. It might have seemed like efficiency. You could show 6 different films, reach 6 different audience segments, maximize that expensive real estate. But what it actually meant was that you had 6 times the projection equipment to maintain, 6 times the staffing needs, and 6 smaller auditoria instead of one commanding, efficient theater. Your fixed costs were distributed across smaller revenue streams. That's not efficiency. That's fragmentation masquerading as progress. The labor costs alone tell the story. A single large palace theater in 1950 might employ 12 people on a full operating day: a manager, 2 projectionists, ushers, a concession operator. A 6-screen multiplex in 1975 might employ 8 to 10 people across all 6 screens combined. The per-screen staffing had dropped dramatically, but that didn't mean labor costs went down. What happened instead is that the theater owner now had to negotiate with increasingly powerful unions over working conditions, benefits, and scheduling across a more complex operation. The union didn't care if you had 6 screens or 1. The per-employee costs were rising, and you couldn't simply cut your way to profitability. Then there was the rent. A suburban multiplex location in 1975 cost significantly more than prime downtown real estate would have cost in 1950, because suburban real estate prices were climbing rapidly. Shopping centers and mall developers understood that movie theaters were anchor tenants that brought foot traffic. They charged premium rents to theater owners, often structured as a percentage of gross ticket revenue plus a base amount. This created a dangerous incentive for the landlord. The more successful your theater became, the more rent you owed. And the landlord controlled your lease renewal, your hours of operation, your parking access, everything. The theater owner was no longer independent. He was a tenant. He was subordinate to the shopping center's master economics. Consider the numbers on a specific representative multiplex from around 1974. This was a 6-screen theater in a growing suburban market, neither a major metropolitan location nor an isolated town. Average ticket price in that year was around $3.25. The theater operated in a shopping center that drew decent weekend crowds. On a typical operating week, that theater might sell approximately 1,200 tickets across all 6 screens. That sounds reasonable, maybe 200 tickets per screen if you're showing 3 films and have decent weekend attendance. At $3.25 per ticket, that's $3.900 in gross ticket revenue per week, but immediately, 50% of that goes to the distributor. The theater owner sees $1.950 in weekly ticket revenue. Now his weekly operating costs, rent on the multiplex space, came to approximately $8.000 per week. This was structured as a base of $4.00 plus a percentage of ticket revenue, so rent was variable as well as fixed, making it harder to predict and harder to control. Labor, that was his largest single expense. On a multiplex, you needed a general manager, a concession manager, and then various ushers and concession workers on rotation. In 1974, that labor bill came to roughly $1.200 per week when you accounted for wages, payroll taxes, and the minimum benefits required by union contracts. Theater unions were relatively strong in this period, even as union power was declining in other sectors. Film rental wasn't just the distributor's cut. It was also film delivery and sometimes insurance costs associated with transporting the prints. That came to roughly $1.50 per week. Utilities, electricity, water, trash in a 6-screen multiplex was expensive, climate control for multiple auditoria, lighting for hallways, projection equipment running all day, even when no customers were there. That was approximately $3.000 per week. Maintenance and repairs were lumpy, but averaged across the year came to about $2.00 per week when you account for carpet cleaning, seat repairs, projectionist training, equipment maintenance contracts. Insurance was another $1.50 per week. So let's add those up. Rent, $8.00, labor, $1.200, film rental and delivery, $1.50, utilities, $3.00, maintenance, $2, insurance, $1.50. Total weekly operating expenses, approximately $2.800. And the weekly ticket revenue after the distributor's cut, $1.950. That means, before concessions, This theater owner is operating at a weekly loss of $8.50. Over 52 weeks, that's a structural operating loss of $4.426 per year just from ticket sales. Concessions in that same week might bring in approximately $1.100 in revenue. After cost of goods, popcorn, candy, soda, napkins, the profit margin was closer to 70 to 75% in this era because concession suppliers were not as consolidated as they would later become. So the theater owner pockets roughly $7.70 in profit from concessions on that week. That still leaves him $8.00 in the hole for the week. Over a year, that's a $4.60 deficit, even with a relatively healthy concession operation. Now, this representation is slightly stylized. The actual theater wouldn't operate in perfectly consistent weekly blocks. Weekends and summer months were much stronger. Winter months in many regions were significantly weaker. Bad weather or a weak film lineup could devastate a week. A well-received blockbuster could create weeks of genuine surplus. But across the full year, this balanced to slightly negative math was accurate for a typical multiplex of that size in that period. The owner was surviving on the concessions. That's the structural reality. The theater itself, as a business, was a vehicle for selling snacks. The movies were the product that brought people into the building, but they were not profitable. They were a loss leader, and an increasingly expensive one. What made this situation even more precarious was that, by the 1970s, competition for those customers was intensifying. Television had already claimed vast swaths of casual moviegoers. The rise of cable television in the late 1970s made it even worse. Home entertainment options were exploding. The theater owner by necessity had to keep his concession prices high enough to offset the structural loss on tickets, but any price increase immediately risked pushing price-sensitive customers away entirely or driving them toward purchasing fewer concessions. It was a tightening noose, and there was almost no escape lever the theater owner could pull. Some theater owners tried to innovate. A few multiplexes experimented with premium concessions, gourmet popcorn options, higher-end candy selections. But this required marketing investment and customer education, and most suburban audiences wanted the familiar, reasonably priced snacks they expected. The upscale positioning didn't work at scale. Others tried to reduce labor costs by cutting hours, running skeleton crews, or automating certain tasks. But you can only automate so much when you need someone at the ticket booth, someone at concessions, and someone in the projection booth. And cutting hours meant reducing your operational availability, which directly cut revenue. Some tried to increase the film frequency, showing more screenings per day to get more attendees per screen, more opportunities to sell tickets and concessions. But this required more labor, more wear and tear on equipment, and ultimately didn't solve the fundamental problem. The per-ticket economics were broken. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the structural model began to show genuine cracks. A new generation of mall multiplexes was being built with more screens, smaller auditoria, and even higher fixed costs. The competition for screen count had become an arms race. Theater chains like AMC and General Cinemas were consolidating smaller independents, and they brought efficiency through scale, but that efficiency came at the cost of eliminating the small, family-owned theater operator almost entirely. For those independent owners still holding on, the mathematics had become almost impossible. The only way to stay afloat was to maintain absolutely rigid cost discipline, extract maximum concession revenue, and hope that the local market was stable enough to generate consistent attendance. In many cases, it wasn't. Small-town multiplexes, drive-in theaters, and independent theater chains began to disappear. The survivors were the large chains with capital reserves deep enough to absorb periodic losses while they rode out recessions and waited for occasional blockbusters to deliver surplus weeks. The concession counter, in other words, had become the only thing keeping the American movie theater business alive. Not the films, not the experience of the theater itself, the popcorn. But here's where the math gets even more interesting. Because while the large chains could absorb theatrical losses by spreading their operating costs across hundreds of screens, they faced a different kind of pressure. They had to maintain uniformity. Corporate mandates dictated exactly how much butter went on each container, what prices could be charged in different markets, how often equipment had to be replaced. This standardization created efficiency, yes, but it also created rigidity. And rigidity in the world of small to medium town theaters was sometimes fatal. Let's talk about the independent operator again, because their story reveals something crucial about why concessions became so critical to survival. Take a hypothetical operator in a town of 18,000 people running a 6-screen cinema. Their fixed costs, rent, property tax, insurance, utilities, manager salary, run about $8,000 per month. That's $96,000 a year before a single ticket is sold. In a town that size, you might average 400 attendees per day across all screens. That's roughly 120,000 attendees per year. At $5 per ticket in 1975, that's $600,000 in gross ticket revenue. Sounds solid until you account for the studio's share. The studio took 55% of ticket revenue during the first 2 weeks of a film's run, 60% during weeks 3 and 4, and 70% after that. Some studios pushed it higher. So from that $600,000 in gross ticket revenue, the independent owner actually netted roughly $240,000 to $270,000 before operating costs. Subtract the $96,000 in fixed costs, and you have $150,000 to $180,000 left. That's your labor, your utilities above the baseline, your maintenance, your marketing, your inventory carrying costs. By the time you've paid for all that, your operating margin on ticket sales alone might be 5 to 8%. Thin, very thin. A single week of low attendance could wipe out the profitability of 2 or 3 good weeks. Concessions, by contrast, offered margins that felt almost luxurious. A large popcorn that cost you about 40 cents to produce, including the kernels, oil, salt, butter flavoring, the container, the napkin, sold for $2.50. That's a gross margin of 88%. A cup of soda that cost you 30 cents to pour sold for $1.75, that's 83%. Candy that the distributor charged you 40 cents for sold for 95 cents. Even accounting for waste, spillage, and unsold inventory at the end of the night, concession margins hovered around 75 to 80% before labor. The labor component was minimal, 1 or 2 people working the counter during peak hours, often teenagers paid minimum wage. So the economic logic became unmistakable. If you wanted to survive as an independent theater owner, you didn't optimize around the movie-going experience. You optimized around the concession stand. You positioned it prominently as patrons entered. You made sure the lines moved fast. You invested in newer popcorn machines if your old ones were breaking down, because a broken machine was lost revenue. You experimented with price increases, carefully, testing the local market's tolerance. You trained your counter staff to upsell, suggesting the larger size, the candy combo, the drink upgrade. And you prayed that your town's population would remain stable and your film selection would be decent enough to keep people coming through the doors. Some operators got creative. They began offering larger sizes at lower per-ounce costs, which sounds generous but actually encouraged higher absolute spending. A customer might balk at paying $2 for a large popcorn, but they'd gladly pay $3.50 for an extra large that represented what they perceived as better value. The per-ounce cost was virtually identical, but the revenue was significantly higher. Others began experimenting with combo deals, bundling popcorn, soda, and candy at a price point that sounded reasonable but delivered even higher margins than selling items individually. These strategies by the 1970s and into the 80s became standard practice across the industry. The studio system, meanwhile, was largely indifferent to all of this. They cared about one metric: ticket sales volume. If a theater generated strong per capita attendance, the studio considered it a success. The fact that the theater's profitability depended almost entirely on selling expensive popcorn was simply not their concern. They weren't running the theater, they were licensing the film. The studio took their percentage and moved on to the next release. This misalignment of incentives became, in retrospect, one of the clearest signs that the old theatrical exhibition model was becoming unstable. The people who controlled the product, the studios, had no direct interest in the financial health of the distribution channel. And the people running the distribution channel, the theater owners, had almost no control over the product quality or release schedule. Into this fragile ecosystem came the first real disruption in the form of something very few people saw coming: home video technology. But before we get there, I want to back up and address something fundamental that the early economics of the American multiplex actually reveal about how American business in general was structured in the post-war era. The multiplex was profitable in the aggregate because it represented something that American capitalism had learned to do extremely well: extract surplus value from a captive audience with inelastic demand. People wanted to see movies. That demand was relatively fixed. The supply, meanwhile, could be tightly controlled by the studios. The rental properties themselves could be leased to operators at terms favorable to the landlord. The concessions could be priced at whatever the market would bear. Every node in the value chain extracted profit. The only weak link was the independent operator who had to reconcile all these pressures simultaneously while maintaining a physical space, managing staff, and dealing with the fact that one bad month could push an entire annual budget into the red. The concession counter was therefore not really a secondary business that happened to coexist with the primary business of showing films. It was, in effect, the primary business disguised as secondary. The theater owner showed movies because movies were what brought the customers through the door, into the lobby, past the concession stand, where the actual margin existed, and the studios showed films in multiplexes because multiplexes were the most efficient way to aggregate the large audiences that kept studio profits healthy. But underneath all of this, underneath the lights, the popcorn machines, the red velvet seats, was a simple economic fact. Someone, somewhere in the chain, was being squeezed. And by the late 1970s, that someone was increasingly the independent theater owner and, paradoxically, the studio itself. This is the exact moment where, if you want to understand the deeper economics of how these theaters actually operated, how the numbers really worked, and what the precise pressure points were that eventually forced consolidation and transformation across the entire industry, our complete ebook guide goes much deeper into the cost structures, the real margins, and the strategic decisions that made or broke theater owners in this era. You'll find that guide linked in the description and pinned in the comments. By the mid-1990s, the math had become inescapable. A single-screen theater owner in a mid-sized American city was looking at annual property costs of $8.0.000 to $1.20.00. Utilities alone, keeping that auditorium climate-controlled year-round, powering the projection booth, lighting the hallways and bathrooms, ran $1 hours of work to $2.5.00 annually. Insurance had climbed to $8 of $1.2.00 per year. Staffing for a theater that wanted to stay open 6 days a week from noon to midnight required at least 5 full-time employees and another 4 or 5 part-timers, totaling a wage bill of $1.80.000 to $2.40,000 annually, before payroll taxes. Your total operating cost before you sold a single ticket was roughly $3.000 to $4.00.00 per year. To break even, you needed to generate that much in gross revenue, but remember, the studios were now taking 50 to 55% of every dollar you collected. That meant you needed to collect roughly $6.00 to $8.0.000 in ticket sales just to cover your basic operating expenses and pay your landlord and your utilities. At an average ticket price of $7 to $8, that translated to somewhere between 75,000 and 115,000 tickets sold per year. A small to mid-sized theater in a regional market might seat 400 people in its main auditorium. If it was a 2-screen theater, maybe 600 total seats. Operating 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year, with an average occupancy rate of 30 to 40%, which was actually optimistic for many markets by the 1990s, you were looking at maybe 30 to 45,000 tickets sold annually. You were short by $2 to $6 per year on your break-even math. And that's before accounting for repairs, unexpected maintenance, or any decline in attendance during the off-season or during a soft period in the release calendar. This is why the multiplex, despite its own operational complexity, actually made more financial sense. A 10-screen multiplex with average screen capacity of 150 to 200 seats each gave you 1.500 to 2.000 total seats. That same 35% occupancy rate now meant 60.00 to 70.000 tickets per year, even accounting for the fact that not every screen would perform identically. Multiplexes also benefited from something single-screen theaters simply could not achieve: efficient scheduling and programming flexibility. You could run a mainstream film on 3 screens, a family film on 2, an action blockbuster on 2 more, and a smaller indie or holdover on the remaining screens. The multiplex owner could also spread fixed costs, rent, utilities, management salaries, across many more revenue-generating screens. A single manager could oversee a multiplex of 10 screens. A single concession stand could serve customers waiting in line for any of 10 different films. A single projection booth with the right equipment could manage most of those screens. The single-screen theater owner was running the exact same fixed cost structure, but distributing it across maybe 1/3 the revenue potential. But there was another subtler factor accelerating the death of independent theaters. The economics of film acquisition itself had shifted. Major studios in the 1980s and 1990s began requiring theater owners to commit to minimum booking periods and minimum guarantees before they would even discuss licensing a film. If you wanted the new Disney or Paramount blockbuster for opening weekend, you often had to guarantee a certain dollar amount in advance, or agree to run it for a guaranteed minimum of 4 to 6 weeks regardless of performance. For a multiplex owner with 10 screens, this was manageable. You could risk $5, $0.000 in guaranteed advance payments across multiple screens for a tentpole release, knowing you had other screens running second-run content or indies to offset the risk. For an independent single-screen owner, a $3 to $5.000 advance commitment on a single film was a huge gamble. If that film underperformed, you had no other screens to buffer the loss. Your entire weekly revenue was riding on a single movie, a single showtime schedule, a single marketing strategy. Furthermore, marketing had become more expensive and less effective for independent theaters. A single-screen theater owner in 1965 could take out a modest ad in the local newspaper, maybe put up some posters around town, and rely on word of mouth. By the 1990s, major studios were spending millions on national television advertising campaigns, radio spots, and by the late 1990s, online marketing and tie-in merchandise. The independent theater owner was expected to augment that national campaign with local marketing, but the cost of a meaningful local television spot had climbed to $5.00 to $1.55 per week. Newspaper ads were costing $3.00 per week for decent placement. A multiplex owner, pooling resources with regional or national chains, could negotiate bulk advertising rates. An independent owner was paying retail. This meant that for a small theater to be competitive with a multiplex 15 miles away, the owner had to invest in marketing that ate directly into already thin margins. Many simply couldn't afford it, so they didn't advertise, their attendance declined, and the downward spiral accelerated. By 1998 and 1999, regional theater chains and national chains were consolidating rapidly. AMC, Regal Cinemas, Cinemark, and a handful of others were acquiring independent and regional chains at accelerating pace. The rationale was clear from the ledgers. Consolidation allowed chains to reduce per-screen operating costs, negotiate better terms with studios, pool marketing budgets, and most importantly, achieve the scale necessary to invest in the latest projection and sound technology without bankrupting individual locations. An independent owner faced a choice: sell to a chain at whatever valuation they could get, or continue operating independently and hope for the best. For most, the math no longer favored hope. A theater building that had been generating $2.50 to $3.50 in annual net income in 1980 was generating $5.00 to $2 5.00 by 1998. The property itself might be worth something, but the business, the ongoing operation, was worth far less than it had been. Many owners sold not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The final blow came from home video and, later, DVD. In the 1980s and early 1990s, VCRs and video rental stores created a direct competitor to the theatrical experience. A family could wait 6 to 9 months for a blockbuster to come to video, rent it for $3 to $5, and watch it at home. The box office didn't collapse immediately. There was still an enormous appetite for the theatrical experience, but attendance plateaued and then slowly declined. Between 1990 and 2000, total U.S. theatrical admissions fell from roughly 1.1 billion to 1.4 billion tickets annually. But during that same period, the number of screens in the country grew from about 23,000 to 37,000. More screens, same or declining attendance, meant per-screen attendance fell dramatically. The independent owner, operating a single or two-screen theater with high fixed costs and no economies of scale, was squeezed harder than anyone. A multiplex chain could afford to run lower occupancy rates because the sheer number of screens generated enough total revenue to cover costs. An independent theater with fewer screens could not. This is the economic reality that killed the independent theater owner. It wasn't a single catastrophic moment. It was a slow compression of margins caused by rising costs, studio consolidation, the leverage studios gained as their number of competitors diminished, changing consumer habits, technological disruption, and the fundamental economics of scale in the multiplex model. The independent theater owner was caught in the middle of all of it. And yet, there's an important truth buried in this history. Some independent theaters survived. A small number of single-screen and art house theaters in college towns, affluent suburbs, and culturally vibrant urban neighborhoods made it through the 1990s and beyond. How? By understanding and accepting that they were no longer competing on the economics of blockbuster films. Instead, they became something else entirely: community gathering places, curators of alternative and independent cinema, havens for film enthusiasts willing to pay a premium for a unique, locally owned experience. The owners of these surviving theaters didn't try to out-multiplex the multiplex. They did the opposite. They leaned into exclusivity, into curation, into the idea that cinema was an art form and a social experience worth protecting. They charged slightly more for tickets. They invested in the physical space, comfortable seating, better concessions, actual conversation with customers. They partnered with independent filmmakers, hosted festivals, created membership programs with loyal audiences who understood the economics of supporting a local business. From a pure financial perspective, this model works for a specific customer and a specific market. A surviving independent theater in a community where 5,000 to 10,000 people have household incomes above $1,000, where there's cultural capital and educational attainment, where people value local institutions, can absolutely operate profitably with 40 to 50% occupancy rates if the average ticket price is $1.2 to $1.5, if concession margins are carefully managed, and if operational costs are ruthlessly controlled. But this required accepting that the days of the high-volume, broad-appeal, multiplex-style independent theater were over. The theater owner who survived was the one who understood that the economics had fundamentally changed, and who was willing to change their business model to match the new reality. The story of the independent theater owner is ultimately a story about the limits of small-scale economics in an age of consolidation. It's about the precise moment when the traditional model, one owner, one or two screens, relying on the studio system to supply films, and trusting that local word of mouth would fill the seats, stopped working. It's about margin compression, technological disruption, and the way that seemingly small cost increases, when compounded over years, can make a once profitable business model completely unviable. Understanding this history matters because the same economic patterns are playing out across dozens of industries right now. The question isn't just what happened to independent theaters. The question is, where are we seeing this same compression of margins, this same pressure toward consolidation, this same shift in consumer habits, right now? What other seemingly stable small businesses are facing the exact same ledger mathematics that killed independent theaters? The answer is everywhere if you know how to look for it. If you want to understand the deeper mathematical and strategic patterns that explain not just theaters but dozens of other failed American business models, and if you want to see detailed case studies showing exactly how the economics of consolidation have played out across different industries, our complete ebook guide goes far deeper into comparative analysis and shows you the precise financial pressure points that have shaped American business over the past 40 years. You can get the guide in the description or the pinned comment, and it's the most comprehensive resource we've put together on this topic. Thank you so much for watching and for spending this time thinking through the real economics of a business that shaped American culture. If you found value in understanding how these numbers actually worked, please subscribe, give this video a like, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. We have so many more forgotten industries and disappeared business models waiting to be explored. End of Part 4. Script complete.